Three, two, one. Hello and welcome to this Leadership Insights podcast. I'm Simon Parker. I'm the founder and chief executive of the Care Leaders Network. And this is Harris Khan, the founder and chief executive of the Curaa Group. Harris, it's great to have you on this Leadership Insights podcast today.
Thanks, Simon. Very happy to be here. I've been wanting to do one of these for a while. So
I'm glad that we finally got there. We probably are a little bit overdue. So hopefully this is the first of many conversations that we can have for the Care Leaders Network. So let's get stuck straight in. So the first question where we always start is, are leaders born or are they made?
I think this is a very challenging question because I have my personal opinion, but then there is quite a lot of literature out there on the topic as well. So I'd say, in my own opinion, leadership is a combination of both things because it is just a set of skills. So obviously, some people are born with the natural ability to swim really fast and they make great swimmers. But if they don't keep at it and keep working on technique, they don't really survive as great swimmers over time, right? So leadership is sort of similar. I think you can be born with a couple of traits which make you naturally inclined to be a leader. So confidence being one of them. But there are so many aspects of it that a lot of it can be learned, with practice. So I think it's a combination of both things.
Combination of both. Okay, great. And in your mind, would you say that leadership is an art or a science? And why would you suggest that?
I don't want to sound like I'm on the fence about pretty much everything that you're going to ask me. I think it's mostly art. But in the same way that art is mostly art, when in reality is mostly science, right? So the people that practice art will tell you that there is a formula to doing what they do. It may not be something that comes naturally to you or I, which is why we then define it as art, or an artist being an artist, because it's not sort of the norm. And I think leadership is the same. I think oftentimes people get confused about what leadership is, and I think we'll come on to that later on. Primarily confusing management or good management and leadership, which are not the same thing. I think is, management is very scientific and can be, but leadership seems very vague because it's, again, a mixture of multiple skill sets. So I'd say it's an art as far as I'm concerned, because I'm still a student and still learning how to be a better leader. And a lot of it feels like, just sort of ordained and not the norm.
Got you. Okay. And you've kind of touched upon this already, but what would you say the difference is between management and leadership?
So this is something that I had the great fortune of learning about myself once I set out to become a manager of my own time. And by that, I mean, I made the concerted effort to stop being an employee and sort of start my own business. Management is effectively like building a house, and you require materials. You need to know where to go and get those materials. You require labor to put those materials together. And you need to be very present, very aware of how much time is being utilized, how much labor is being utilized, whether the right materials are being used at the right time. So it's a lot of project management type skill set. And then you can apply those skills to, running a team, small or large, running a department, running a business. But the skill set roughly remains the same. Leadership is knowing why you want to build a house, knowing what the house should look like, knowing where the house should be built and why, and then convincing everybody else around you to also buy into the fact that that is in fact the best place to build a house for exactly the reasons that you've said, and then ensure that everybody is sort of enticed and excited about doing that particular project. So that, I think, is the key difference between leadership and management. And I started this by saying that I was very lucky to learn about this because I know somebody who has been working in HR for several decades, and they decided to do a skills test on a number of their friends. I happen to be one of those people. I won't name the test because that's not relevant, but when I did the test, it was 140 questions, I think, and it very neatly broke down the skill set that I actually have. And I was surprised to learn that most of my skill set aligns to leadership. And here I was thinking I'm an amazing manager, but I possess very few of those skills actually. So I think that for me, that was very eye-opening, knowing that leadership is in fact very different from management, and there is space for both. Sometimes I do look at, articles and news and social media in particular, where both things get conflated quite a lot. And people think that, leadership is extremely cool and they align it to being an entrepreneur, which isn't entirely true. To be a good entrepreneur, to be a successful entrepreneur, you need to be a very good manager of resource, for example. And I know you and I have talked about this quite a few times, about how you need to make sure that you know exactly how you're utilizing the hours that you have been given, right? That has nothing to do with leadership, but good management rather. Anyway, I went off piece there. So let's get back to it. What's the next question?
Next question. So at what point does somebody become a leader?
I think when they decide that they're ready to start learning how to become one. When we were talking right at the top of this conversation, and I said that, it can be learned because it's such a wide variety of skills that need to be utilized to actually be a good leader. Anyone can really do it if they decide that that is something that they want to do. It is a double-edged sword, though, because leaders do fall out of favor. And when that happens, you need to be able to learn to deal with that failure so that you can go back at becoming a leader again, or being useful as a leader. So I think that whenever you are ready, you can start by learning empathy. I think that is a critical element of leadership. And it's not a trait that you are born with. It is in fact something that is learned. So I think that will be the start of anyone's journey into leadership. And of course, then there is lots of literature to read and lots of observation to be done. There are many, many leaders in the UK and globally who are, whose stories are available to learn lots of lessons from. So we can all decide to be leaders, but ultimately it will only really work when we are truly committed to learning and learning every day.
Great point. I think around the learning side of things, it's a never-ending journey as well. So, what common misconceptions do you think that people often have about both leaders and about leadership?
I think people often think that leaders have all the answers. And the reality is that they're not more knowledgeable, they're not more intelligent, they don't possess supernatural power. They are fallible, they make mistakes. I think, when we start assigning kind of superhuman phenomenon to leaders, we basically set them up to fail in our own minds. So I think that is something that we need to do away with. Leaders are humans, they are vulnerable, they make mistakes. And, like you just said, it is a constant journey for them to continue to find that path on which to set themselves upon and their teams upon for success, right? So one of the traits that you can ascribe to a good leader is, if we go back to that house analogy that I used, having the vision to know what the right thing to do is in that particular moment in time, and then having the tenacity and the guts to actually start that process and then see it through. Those are the key skill sets. And very often, when you are doing those things, as you know from personal experience, you don't actually know whether or not you're going to end up where you think you're going to end up. But what you do know is you will end up somewhere, and that'll be better than where you are today. And it's that sometimes people don't understand. And then a leader is only as good as the team behind them. And if they lose the confidence of the team, then it's very hard to actually deliver whatever vision or goal that they have set themselves to deliver. So I think it's necessary for people to understand that they must not ascribe some supernatural traits to their leaders, but in fact trust in their leader's gut instinct to deliver what it is they've said they will deliver.
That trust thing, I guess, has got to be one of the most important things out there. What would you say that the difference is between a good leader and a great leader?
I don't know. This is a very tricky question. I think that a great leader, and I'm not suggesting that I am one, because like I said, I've just started. But I've been lucky enough to work with a few people who I would say are great leaders. Great leaders lead with empathy and on the basis of principle. So I think that having a good, strong moral code helps leaders navigate difficult times. Great leaders navigate difficult times a lot better than others. And so I would say that that's a critical difference. The fact that they have empathy and they have a strong moral compass. And I think then there are other things that you could ascribe to a great leader, one of which would be somebody who is actually comfortable to not lead and allow people from within their teams to become leaders. That is a great trait for a leader, I think.
So almost like it's almost like the succession planning mind. So to empower, to embrace the team, to take on more responsibility, to be able to create an environment where the kind of almost the future aspiring leaders have space to be able to grow and develop.
Yeah, exactly right. Because look, ultimately, what I often see in good leaders, people who have, great vision, great tenacity, great execution, sometimes they become untrusting of their teams. And by that, what I mean is not that they think that somebody's going to steal staplers from the office. No, they don't trust the advice that their team gives them. And then they lose out because of it. And the reality is, if you believe, as I do, that leadership can be learned, then there could be the next generation of leaders working with you already. And to know when to step aside and let the next generation, pick up the gamut and run with it is a pretty phenomenal trait. I mean, I learned a lot because people who I worked with and worked for had faith in me and allowed me to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes, but continue to build on how much responsibility I was taking. And I think that that taught me many valuable lessons that I deploy now.
Being able to take that knowledge from and take that influence from people who are great leaders, also people who aren't great leaders as well, can be so powerful, because if you work out how to flip bad leadership on its head and do the polar opposite often, being in that environment and just coming back to your earlier point about learning leadership, I think is one of those key attributes. So perfect segue into my next question, but you've alluded to a few different characteristics that you think are important for leaders. What would you say the top 3 most important characteristics are for leaders?
I would say, I've forgotten what I said now, but I'd say the most important from my perspective would be empathy. And that's a learned behavior, so anybody can learn it. The other would be tenacity. So to continue to go on, even when other people are starting to fall away. And then I think being a constant learner, I think that's critical. And being very aware that you don't have all the answers, so you must continuously seek knowledge to acquire answers, knowledge or experience.
A quick note about one of the sponsors that makes the Care Leaders Network podcast possible. Compass Associates works in partnership with the care sector by supporting care providers with their recruitment and retention needs. They've won a number of industry awards over the years and specialise in placing mid to senior roles in the elderly care sector. Compass have offices in Portsmouth and Manchester, but deliver their services nationwide. And to find out more, head to www.compassltd.co.uk. 3 solid answers, thank you. How is leadership evolving over time?
You know, I mean, I've only been around for 40 years. I don't know what it was like in the many decades that I wasn't around before that. But, if we look back on history and we look at the great generals and the great kings and queens, we look at history books for lessons, I think a lot of what is said in those texts is still what holds true for good and great leaders. I don't really think that it evolves, in that leadership is driven primarily by the constituents or either the people that you are leading. And because humans haven't evolved that much in the last 1,000 odd years, the traits that you require, that you combine together to make into a leader, they haven't changed. If you are a great general that is going into battle, you also need to be a great salesperson, like a good leader, right? You need to be able to convince people to follow you on a path which they cannot see. But you must convince them that you can see it, and your gut instinct tells you that this is what you must be doing. And then they follow you to the ends of the earth because you are a great leader. So I don't really think that it's changed dramatically. I think we have a lot of interference now And we also have a lot of people who sometimes conflate good management or great management with leadership, which makes it a little bit more difficult for leaders to do what they're supposed to do and for managers to do what they're supposed to do. But ultimately, I think that, the traits haven't changed. So I don't really see, and I don't really see them changing dramatically. Because if you're leading with empathy, if whether you did it 300 years ago or today, the topics upon which you must be empathetic may have changed, but the fact that you have empathy and that you listen to the people that you're meant to be leading hasn't changed. So I don't think that there's much change.
Got you. Okay, great. Thank you. What would you say what are the biggest challenges that you've faced as a leader, and what are the learnings that you've had as a consequence?
There's numerous, I would say, numerous. And before I answer the question, I have to say I'm very grateful for the opportunity to learn. I'm very, very grateful for that, because it makes me feel that I'm progressing on my journey. And it also makes me feel like I'm doing a better job of being a leader. Because as I mentioned earlier, I have discovered that even though I thought I was a great manager, I in fact possess very few of those traits. So I'm working on that too. But I'd say, look, the sector that we're in is a challenging one. And this is my third career now. I'd say certainly this has been the most challenging, and primarily because I have to choose my words carefully, but primarily because this is much more labor intensive than capital intensive, if that makes sense. And I've been used to working in more capital intensive businesses. Working in a labor intensive business where I see the value of people dramatically differently than, for example, the government. But being restricted in how to compensate people for the value that they generate in our sector, because I am beholden as a business person to our shareholders, and also limited in how much I can spend on my labor force. I think that's always been an issue for me from a moral perspective, but recently has become a huge challenge from a day-to-day management perspective because of the cost of living crisis. And I do these all staff meetings where I go to each of our locations and I try and have conversations with all the staff. And I have to say this past month has been very difficult. Listening to people's stories and listening to how difficult they are finding it to manage on, the meager financial resource that they have. I made the mistake of trying to lighten the mood, and it did not go down very well. And so I learned a lesson. And of course, I apologized, but I think, sometimes leaders don't show vulnerability and aren't honest about when they make mistakes. And actually, that is one of the worst traits you can have, because once I'd apologized, I could even tell that I had been forgiven in the same conversation, which was a great relief, because obviously my commentary is never really malicious. It's, it was really me trying to make light of a situation which I have no control over, really. And this goes back to, that point that we were talking about earlier. What are the sort of traits that people assign to leaders which aren't really fair or true? I don't really know how to solve the cost of living crisis. I know the solution isn't going to be that, all care homes start paying their staff £15 an hour, because then the care homes won't survive. And so I had to very quickly assess whether or not I could have that discussion with my audience. And then in the end, I decided that I would. And so I did a very short, very high level profit and loss account while I was having the all staff meeting. After I'd upset them and then apologized, I told them the finances of how a care home works. And, we ended up having a very good discussion. And that was because I chose to be transparent and I chose to be vulnerable. I chose to admit my mistake. And, it was a fantastic case of why empathy is so important. I should have started with that. I should have said, I know it's really tough. But this business is also going to struggle, as are all other care homes. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but it's already in the press now. I think it was in the Times today or one of the newspapers about how care homes are already struggling. And we haven't even had the full brunt yet because some of us are on fixed tariffs. So sorry for going off piece, but the lesson in summary, or the toughest time as a leader that I have experienced is now. I'm experiencing it now and learning how to deal with it in real time.
Which in itself is a challenge, to be that dexterous in your leadership approach, to be able to feel out the contours of the kind of the social dynamics and to be able to conduct yourself in a way which is going to be consistent with getting people on board and getting people excited about the future, even in difficult sets of circumstances. So for your own kind of personal inspiration and drive, like which leaders inspire you most personally?
This is a very interesting question because my answer is no one. And I often wondered whether I would ever be able to become a leader because I don't have any, or I didn't have any mentors, and I never really engaged with people who impressed me much on a day-to-day basis. And that was until I figured out that actually there is inspiration everywhere if you choose to look for it. And it's not that you are going to get a full package by looking at one person. In fact, that can be quite dangerous. So what I started to do was start looking at skill sets. Who has shown a lot of empathy as a leader, who has shown a lot of tenacity as a leader, who has shown, do you see what I mean? It's more about which people display what skill set, which ultimately adds up to being a great leader, in my opinion. And so I try and emulate those sort of traits in my own leadership. So I don't really have somebody that I can mention that I can say, look, this is a fantastic leader and I'm trying to do everything that they were doing. It's a whole host of skill sets, and I'm trying to find the best in class for all of them.
Quick word about one of the sponsors who helps make the Care Leaders Network podcast possible. Bevan Britton works in partnership with the social care sector, delivering high quality legal and regulatory advice. Their award-winning teams across the UK provide workforce, regulatory, corporate, commercial, real estate and litigation advice, and their team truly believes in strong partnerships. They really understand what it takes to deliver outstanding care and to build a thriving business. To find out more, head to bevanbritton.com. so that you can integrate the different characteristics and skills into you being the
Yeah.
best of you.
Yep, that's exactly right. Because like I said, there's some skills that I was born with. I have uh, I've recognized that. But then there are many others that I am continuously trying to teach myself. And so if you have that construct of this is what a leader is, 15 different skill sets, 3 you were born with and you've been working on for your whole life. But then the other 12, you need to first figure out what those are, and then you need to find, a few people that are displaying those so that you can learn from those. I can tell you though that one of the best books on leadership I ever read was actually Shoe Dog by Phil Knight.
Great book.
Yeah, I know you and I talked about it before. And I think that just the fact that this individual chose to be so honest and so vulnerable in that book probably puts him at the top of my list, because that book is unlike any other business book I've ever read, because it talks not at all about him and how great a visionary he was, and because he is. I mean, that is the brand of all brands that he has developed. And initially, they didn't even have their own shoes, somebody else's shoes. So it's pretty phenomenal when you think about it. But the fact that that book is full of all of the mistakes he made and the lessons that he learned from those mistakes, and then sometimes even repeated those mistakes. I think that is the type of book that really people need to be writing for, so that it's warts and all. You know exactly what it is, rather than marketing spin.
That's one of the most interesting things about that particular book. Just getting it, like you can look at it, if you separate what he achieves in the process of the book, you could kind of look at that and go, God, that guy's life sucks. Because it's just him going.
I agree.
Him going from
drama. Non-stop drama.
There's cash flow issues, there's product issues, there's competition issues, there's all of the stuff that he faces in that book, and you can just tell, like, it comes from a real place of it is genuine vulnerability. But like, yeah, there's hopefully it probably makes people feel better reading that book as well. Any set of circumstances where they're at, where they think to themselves, well, it must be nice to be Phil Knight because he's got this big old company. He's been through the mill like you wouldn't believe in so many different ways. And that reading that book, it used to be one of my running partners. When I read it, I ran it running just for kind of context sake. And I think I ended up listening in. It's one of the few books that I listened to twice, one after another, because I was a little bit like, there's so much in this. If I re-listen to it, I'm going to hear it almost like a different story. And it was exactly the case, because there's so much stuff in there, and a lot of it is just painful experiences of really difficult sets of circumstances, and how he gets through them every single time. Correct. Well, anyway, which is testament to his tenacity, key characteristic that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So I think he was, it's just that the guy has a vision and he just starts running towards it, and there are a lot of firsts in that business's history, a lot of firsts. For example, partnerships with athletes didn't really happen before. You paid a famous face to do an advert, but you weren't in partnership with them. That was a Nike invention. A Phil Knight invention, in fact. And so it's quite, I think, Phil Knight, just because of the fact that he chose to write that book and share with everybody, in all honesty, what it is to be a leader, because he was not a good manager. He was a leader. I thought it was a bold move and pretty phenomenal.
so often the case. Often people have a mixture of leadership and management skills, but typically you gravitate from one to the other. They don't need to be mutually exclusive, and in the right role, they one is not better than the other. It's more just a case of the fact that the right person needs to be doing the right thing, and to match that those areas, characteristics, and things themselves. So, what would you say the best piece of leadership advice is that you've ever been given?
Never really had a lot of leadership advice as such, but the thing that I've taken from my own sort of research and reading is how not to allow ever for things to rule you. So I think that allows better judgment. So your emotions shouldn't overrule your, let's say, moral code of how you make a decision. And your desires shouldn't either. So just because you want to be the CEO of a company that has 3,000 employees doesn't mean the best thing for you to do as a leader or the business itself is for you to go out and get 10 new shareholders. That may not necessarily be the right path, but because your ego sometimes drives you to do things, you may end up doing it anyway. So I think that that's the best advice that I hold very dear to my own decision making, is that I try my best not to allow my emotions or my desires to control me. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting. One of my all-time greatest inspirations in the context of leadership is a chap called Jocko Willink. So he's YouTube, search him if you're interested in finding out more. But so he was the platoon commander for the Battle of Ramadi. He's a Navy SEAL, an American soldier. He's retired now, but he's basically ended up setting up a management consultancy called Echelon Front, which is all about taking his experience from the military and then helping business leaders to benefit from those learnings. And basically the biggest thing he ever talks about is how do you get leaders to stay calm in difficult sets of circumstances? And really that's what you're talking about there. It's how can you make sure that what's going on around you is you're making decisions on the basis of the signal rather than noise. And when you're in a leadership position and there's when you're running a company and you've got how many team members and there's all these fires that need putting out and there's all this stuff that you want to achieve in the future, it's really hard. It's really, really hard because there's so much to focus on, but working out the managing to stay, keeping yourself cool under pressure and making well-informed decisions on the basis of the best possible information that you can have at the time, because you're never going to have all the information, and being able to commit to that it's a real virtue, and it's so hard to be able to achieve because most people get it wrong a lot of the time. And yeah, when that happens, you also need to be able to own the decision at the time as well, and then to be able to deal with that next difficult set of circumstances that maybe wasn't the ideal decision, but you've got to rise above the noise and achieve a certain level of equanimity in the moment to make those decisions.
Yeah, I agree. I think ultimately what matters to me is that I try and make the right decisions for the right reasons 80% of the time. If I'm able to do that, I don't care much what others give me as accolades. I will be very proud of myself if I can do that.
I think that last point I think is super, super important, because you're never going to get it right all of the time. But if you can consistently be aware of, be mindful of the fact that you are going to make mistakes, but make good enough decisions that you're generally trending in the right direction. Ultimately, that's all that you can expect anyone, any leader, any person in that respect as well, because we're all fallible. We've all got our quirks and the mistakes, obviously, that we all make. So yeah, I think that's a real key point. I think that's probably going to be my biggest takeaway from our conversation. Although one last question to ask before we wrap things up. So Harry, so you're standing at a lectern in front of a room of aspiring leaders, and you have 1 minute to inspire them. What do you say?
It is absolutely critical to recognize what your skill sets are and to not view them as an end, but in fact a beginning. And what I mean by that is that once you're aware of what you can do, you also become aware of what you can't do. And then the responsibility shifts back onto yourself to teach yourself or to make sure that you are in a position to learn all of the things that you've identified that are missing.
I think that's super important advice. Thank you so much, Harris. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today and sharing your leadership insights.
Thank you very much, Simon.